10 and leadership roles this morning. I was just finishing off printing out my material this morning at about 25 to 10. I thought, oh, I'll just check who's scheduled to do what this morning. So I opened up the schedule and hello, it finished last week. So everyone did a great job without notice. I really appreciate that. Okay, great to have our visitors with us. I've got a couple apparently from Fiji. Really great to have you with us. I hope you feel welcome. Also good to have Sue with us. We all know Sue pretty well. Also great to have Ben come along as well. Okay, we're studying Ephesians chapter 4. We're in the chapter that's, in the passage that's 7 to 16. Now I know I've got way too much material this time, so I'm just going to keep going until time finishes, and then we'll carry on next time. The section I want to really concentrate this time is verse 11. Verse 11 is about various leadership roles that God gave, but I'll just read through to remind us of where we started last week from verse 7. Now to each one of us was given this grace according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, ascending on high, he led captivity captive, and he gave gifts to men. Now he ascended, what is it except that he also descended to the lower regions of the earth? The one who descended himself is also the one who ascended above all the heavens in order that he might fill all things. That section's really just about the divinity of Jesus. He came from heaven to the earth, and then he went back to heaven, and then he gave gifts to men. And the gifts he's talking about here is really defined in verse 11, and that's what we're going to concentrate on today. And he gave gifts. In the text that we're using today, it says some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers. As we talked about last week, in the original text, which is the Greek text, it really says he gave the apostles and the prophets. In other words, what that, I believe, means is he gave the office of the apostles. He gave the office of the prophets. He gave the office of the evangelists. It doesn't literally say he gave a few people the right to be apostles. We gave a few others the right to be evangelists. It doesn't actually say that. I know in the text it's translated that way, but in the original it's not that way. Notice what the appointment of these various offices was for. Verse 12, for the equipping of the saints. So the purposes of these groups is to lead the congregation in such a way so that the congregation became more skilled, more qualified as fellow Christians. That's particularly the role of the leadership within the church. Verse 12, for the equipping of the saints. Not going to dwell on that because we did a fair bit on that last week. For the work of ministry, to enable us to be able to minister to ourselves, to other people, to the church more effectively. That's the role of this leadership group that's being talked about. And then for the building up of the body of Christ. What I want to do, as I said, is look at especially the role of the apostles and the role of the evangelists in this section, just see how far we get with it. But before I get to that, I want to look at a couple of passages where the Bible talks about who actually does the church belong to. Today we have a huge number of different groups that, call themselves Christian, but a lot of their structure is very different. The names they use for different offices is different. The roles they have for various things are different. Let's have a look at Matthew 16:18. And I say also that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. The one who's speaking there is Jesus. This is before his death. Peter, he's just asked Peter, who did you say that I am? And he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And based on that statement, Jesus says, you are Peter, and on this rock, he's not talking about Peter. Peter's not the rock. The rock is the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Everything about Christianity depends on that. That's the very foundation of our existence as Christians. If that's not true, Christianity means nothing. So the rock is Jesus, the fact that Jesus is the Son of God, which Peter has just stated. But he said, on this rock, on the fact that I am the Son of God, I will build my church. So the builder of the church, in this case, possibly you can more say the architect of the church, the designer of the church, and then when he goes back to heaven, he builds it remotely, if you like. But the fact is that Jesus is the one who directed the construction of the church. And we're not talking about a building, obviously. We're talking about a group of people, an organization. And notice he says, the gates of Hades will not overpower it. What I understand that to mean, Jesus is about to die. He's saying, I'm going to build my church. Very soon after this, he dies. And the gates of Hades was a way of referring to death. Hades is the waiting place of the dead. So what I think he means is, even though I'm going to die, I am still going to build my church. And we know some of the apostles, or most of the apostles, except possibly John, got discouraged when Jesus died, and they denied him or they ran away, didn't want to get mixed up with what was going on. So they lost confidence in what Jesus said. But then when Jesus came back again, when he was resurrected, they said, they could understand what was going on more effectively, and they became faithful again. So when Jesus says, I will build my church, I think what he's saying here, nothing is going to get in the road of what I'm going to do as far as my church is concerned. In other words, what I'm trying to say is the way Jesus built the church was the way he wanted it. It wasn't just an option that we could follow if we wanted to, or we can pick and choose our own organization if that's what we would prefer. He says, I will build my church, and nothing will stop that, effectively. So to me, what we have to look at is, how did Jesus build his church? What was the structure of the church that Jesus built? And if we can see that structure, then to me, that's what we've got to follow. He's not giving us a choice to do whatever we want, as far as the organization goes. If we're followers of Jesus, then that's what we've got to do. Okay, the other passage, kind of related to that, Ephesians 2, verses 18 through 22, consequently, therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. So he's talking about people who have become Christians, become part of the church, and then referring to the church or the household of God, and that's just another term for the church. He said it's built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. In other words, Jesus was remotely building the church through the work of the apostles and prophets. And then Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone. And the cornerstone was something the builders first put down, and all the lines for where the building was supposed to go would come from that cornerstone. So if you get the cornerstone wrong, the whole building's going to be wrong. You get the cornerstone right and base everything on that cornerstone, then the whole building is going to be correct. And that's really what Paul is saying here. If we build this church, this building, based on Jesus as the cornerstone which directs everything, everything's going to be correct. Verse 21, in whom the whole building joined together grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are built up together into a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. That's what the church is. It's a dwelling place for God in the Spirit. And that's a very beautiful picture to me of what the church is really all about. Sometimes we come simply because we got friends here and we like seeing them once a week, or we just like the general fellowship, or, sometimes we have all different reasons. But the real reason we should be coming is because in the church we truly have fellowship with God. Jesus is with us. He's promised when we worship together, 2 or 3 or more are gathered together, there with you always. Also, rather. It's a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. You know, to me, that's a fabulous picture of what the church is really all about. So if we've got to do things the way Jesus has designed it, to me, this verse 11 is, if you like, the design Jesus has given for the leadership within the church. He appointed the apostles, and they worked to establish the church. They were the original builders, if you like, of the church. And they built it the way Jesus instructed them to build it. There were the prophets who spoke on behalf of God and gave messages early on to the church before we had the Bible so that we could look up what's required ourselves. Then you've got the evangelists. And we're going to look at that in a bit more detail. Don't know whether we'll get onto it today, but we'll certainly do it next week. And then some as pastors and teachers. And it does kind of seem to me there he's referring to pastors and teachers as being the same group. And we know pastors is one role and teachers is a different role, but the pastor, one of his qualifications was to be able to teach. So that was very much a part of the pastor's role. I won't get on to defining the pastor. May be different to what you... Oh, no, sorry, I probably will get on a little bit, but not just yet. So, the church belongs to Christ, quite literally. He set it up. He established it. He gave the rules that we are supposed to follow as his church. The leadership he gave were these particular elements. I want to look at a few things regarding apostles. Not something we talk about very much because it's not something that's terribly relevant today. But nonetheless, I want to have a look at them because they were very important in the original establishment of the church in the first, especially the first century. Now, as far as qualifications, Jesus originally appointed the 12. In the end, there was 14 apostles in terms of the official apostles. There was the 12, then Judas hung himself because he was unfaithful. Barabbas? I've got it written here, I know, but I can't quite remember offhand. Anyway, the Jerusalem church, because Judas had hung himself, they had appointed a new one. And then later we see Paul becomes an apostle. The apostle Paul becomes an apostle. So altogether there was 14. But we can see when they were in Acts chapter 1, when they decided to appoint someone to replace Judas, there were particular qualifications they used to decide who was going to replace him. So in verse 21 of Acts chapter 1, therefore it is necessary for one of the men who have accompanied us during all the time in which the Lord Jesus went in and went out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day on which he was taken up from us, one of these men must become a witness of the resurrection together with us. So they're appointing a replacement apostle. There are really two qualifications that they used to decide who could replace that apostle. One was he had to go out, in and out with Jesus the whole time during Jesus' ministry. And it says, beginning in verse 22, beginning from the baptism of John until the day when he was taken up. So whoever became a replacement had to be someone who was with Jesus all through that period, received directly Jesus' instruction, etc. And the second one was, one of these men must become a witness of the resurrection. I think that has two ideas within it. The idea of a witness is partly that you go out and tell people about something. But it also means someone who actually was an eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus. In other words, this replacement apostle had to be someone who actually witnessed the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, those two qualifications in themselves, or could you say, eliminate the vast majority of people. Under those qualifications, once someone got an association with Christianity after the death, burial of Jesus, because they were after that point, that of necessity disqualified them for being apostles. In other words, there are no new apostles under this qualification. Now, obviously that's not the only qualification to be an apostle. Because we know Paul became an apostle. He didn't travel with Jesus. He wasn't, I don't believe, an eyewitness of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And yet he has become probably the most revered, in some ways most important, most influential apostle of them all. And yet he didn't qualify under this situation. Okay, if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, verses 8 through 9, and last of all, as it were, to one born at the wrong time, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. Notice he doesn't say he wasn't worthy to be called an apostle because he wasn't with Jesus all during that time, because I didn't qualify under that other system of an apostleship. He didn't say that. He said it was because I persecuted the church of God. He's quite happy with the idea that he is a legitimate apostle. So what's something that really unifies both these groups? Those that travelled with Jesus during his actual ministry, and Paul's being, if you like, born out of due season. And the thing that unites them, and this is what makes them all apostles, is the fact they were actually appointed by Jesus. They were called to be apostles by Jesus. One was through the qualification. One was a literal calling. Jesus actually appeared to Paul and chose him to be an apostle. So to me, in the end, that's the real definition of who truly is an apostle. Those that are actually chosen by Jesus. I don't believe there was any other apostles in that sense chosen after the Apostle Paul. I don't believe Jesus legitimately appeared to anyone after he appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus and chose him as an apostle. And the only other way to become an apostle was, as we looked in Acts chapter 1, if you were actually travelling with Jesus during his ministry and you were an eyewitness to the death, burial, and resurrection. If Jesus did appear today to someone, and literally it was Jesus, and he chose him as an apostle, then he would be an apostle. But that hasn't happened for nearly a couple of thousand years now. And I don't believe it's going to happen. If it happened, if Jesus really did appear to someone, and we could have no doubt whatsoever that it was Jesus, then he has the right to appoint whichever person he wants as an apostle. But there is no evidence whatsoever that he's done anything after the apostle Paul. But Paul was a legitimate apostle. Now, there's another statement made in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 12. Indeed, the signs of an apostle. How did the apostles demonstrate to people that they truly were apostles of Jesus? The signs of an apostle have been done among you with all patient endurance, both signs and wonders and deeds of power. Now, if someone appeared to us today and was able to raise the dead. I had a parent who was actually in a coffin, and someone came along, and I knew they were dead. I mean, they'd been dead for a few days. They'd medically examined, and they were dead. They hadn't moved, they hadn't breathed. There was no brain activity. And someone comes along and brings them back to life. I would have to listen to what that person had to say. And if that person said, I am the Son of God, I would have to take him seriously. Or in the, back in this time, I'm the Apostle Paul. I would have to take them seriously. The thing is about the miraculous gifts, they were just designed to back up the truth of what the people that had those powers said. So in other words, if someone came along and claimed to be an apostle, but he couldn't do the works, he couldn't perform miracles, then he's not an apostle. But if Paul comes along and he says, I'm the Apostle Paul, oh yeah, prove to us you're the Apostle Paul. All he's got to do, and he could do this, was work some sort of a miracle, and they would have to accept it. It's only people that God is working through that are able to perform miracles. So it wasn't a sign of an apostleship, but it had to go on, I think, with the claim that he was an apostle. Because a lot of people were able to work miracles that weren't apostles. The other element that's a little different about the apostles, they had the ability to pass that miraculous gift on to other people, where it's pretty clear in the New Testament that just having the ability to work those miracles didn't allow you automatically to be able to give them to other people as well. But the apostles could certainly do that. Okay, now, this is a point I found interesting when I studied it over the years. Are there other people who the Bible referred to as apostles? And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending, there are. So I want to just quickly look at a few of those. Acts 14 and verse 14. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard about this, they tore their clothing and rushed out into the crowd shouting something. Okay, notice it says when the apostles, clearly says apostles, Barnabas and Paul, Barnabas there, who I don't believe was ever actually appointed as an apostle, we got no record of it, but he's described here as an apostle, along with Paul. Then you've got 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 23. If there was a question concerning Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for you. If there is a question concerning our brothers, they are messengers, and the word behind that messengers is actually apostolos. The translators have just chosen to give it its kind of English meaning rather than translating it into or transliterating it into the English word. Transliterating was you take a word that sounds like apostolos and you just turn it into apostle. Whereas taking apostolos and turning it into messenger is a translation. Okay? So the translators here chose to use the original meaning of it. So they are messengers, they are apostles of the churches, the glory of Christ, etc. Okay, so here, Titus is described as an apostle. So how does that fit in? Okay, Philippians 2 and verse 25. But I consider it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, but your messenger, again, that translation of the word apostolos, and servant of my needs. And then Paul says he claims to be an apostle. Okay, so how can those qualifications I gave about being an apostle be right, and yet these other people being referred to apostles as well? The whole key is who appointed them to be apostles. There is a difference between who appointed the person as apostles and just the general term for the word apostle. Both those situations exist in the New Testament. In this case, where is it? Which verse? Okay, 2 Corinthians 8:23. If there is a question concerning our brothers, they are, referring to Titus and others probably, they are messengers or apostles of the churches. The whole idea of an apostle is who sent the apostles, who chose the apostles, and who sent them out with what authority. The apostles of Christ, the ones appointed by Christ, are what we generally refer to as the 12 apostles, or in this case there was 14 of them, plus Paul, plus the other one. So what gave those ones their special authority was the fact that they were chosen especially by Jesus and sent out with a particular role. Titus, in this case, it says he was a messenger or apostle of the churches. So his authority came from the churches, or a church, choosing him to do a particular role and giving him whatever authority that church had the right to give him. And that's hugely different from someone who was actually chosen by Jesus and given a specific role by Jesus. These other ones weren't chosen by Jesus, they were just people who were sent out in the general sense of someone who was representing, if you like, a particular congregation of people with a particular word. Maybe it was to take a particular message of what was going on in one congregation and tell another about something. That was what he was sent out to do. Or to take a contribution to the poor saints in Jerusalem, whatever it was. Okay, so that's the difference between other people that are described as apostles and what we understand as the 12. But what I'm saying is we can't appoint people as apostles with the same authority that the original apostles had, because what qualified them to become those people no longer exists. So they were vitally important to the church in the beginning. They only have relevance today historically. If we say, I am an apostle of Jesus, we are incorrect. Can we say, I am an apostle of such and such a congregation? When we worked in Albania, our sending out congregation was, I can't remember what it was called. It was a church in Broad Street. It's called Broad Street Church of Christ in Lexington, Tennessee. They oversaw our work. They gave us the authority to go out, work in Albania to try and establish congregations there. So we were apostles in that sense of that congregation. But I could not say I was the same as these original apostles. I would be deluding myself to say that. But in this sense, I could say that. In a lot of ways, in a secular sense, the modern apostle is an ambassador to another country. They are sent out by the government of one country to represent that country in the US, in England, in France, wherever it is. And they have authority to act based on instructions from the sending organisation, which in this case would be the New Zealand government. That's really the idea of the apostle. So you always consider when you're looking at someone who calls apostle, where are they apostle of? Because that will determine what sort of authority they have. Okay, well I said I'm going to stop when the time run out. Time has run out, so I'll have to stop. It looks like there's going to be at least 3 lessons in this lot. But I would quite like to get over it all in the end because I think it's fairly relevant information for us. I appreciate your attention. Really appreciate our visitors. Really grateful for them being here. Hope you'll be quite happy to come back. Or really hope I get a chance to talk to you after the service. Anyway, we'll finish there.